Air in the cellar always tasted of wet iron and old lime, but tonight it tasted like burning hair. Julian stood in the center of the damp stone floor, his boots planted firmly inside a circle of gray ash he had spent 3 hours gathering from abandoned fireplaces across town. In his left hand, he held a leather-bound journal with pages that felt suspiciously stiff, like dried skin. In his right, a black tallow candle flickered, with a flame the color of bruised plums. The house above him was silent, too silent. Ever since his younger brother's disappearance in this very basement 6 months ago, the ambient sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the rattling of the commuter rail 2 blocks over, seemed to die the moment they crossed the property line. Julian raised his voice, reading from the 3rd page of the journal. The language wasn't Latin, nor was it any tongue recorded by historians. It sounded like wet gravel grinding inside a throat. O Kla, Veshta, Inkaden. The candle flame stretched, pulling into a thin, violent needle of violet light. The cellar temperature plummeted instantly, sending a thick plume of white vapor rolling from Julian's parted lips. His breath hitched. He wanted to stop, but the memory of David's voice, scratching from behind the basement wall 3 nights prior, pushed him forward. He read the 2nd stanza. The stone walls didn't just echo. They groaned. Mortar dusted down from the ceiling like gray snow. In the far corner of the cellar, where the shadows were always thickest, the darkness began to unspool. It didn't step forward. It detached itself from the wall, a tall, impossibly thin silhouette that seemed to stretch infinitely upward, its head pressing flat against the timber floorboards of the kitchen above. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He couldn't move his feet. The ash circle beneath him felt burning hot, yet frost was creeping up his pant legs. The entity had no face, only a vertical fissure down the center of its upper mass that slowly pried open, revealing, not eyes, but an abyss of absolute suffocating static. A sound filled Julian's mind, not a voice, but a chorus of wet, choking gasps, thousands of them overlapping, drowning out his own thoughts. "You called," the entity whispered. It didn't use air. The words vibrated directly inside Julian's skull, rattling his teeth. "My brother," Julian choked out, tears instantly freezing on his cheeks. "David, where is he?" The shadow tilted its form at an unnatural, sickening right angle. A sound like snapping dry timber echoed through the room. From the base of the entity, the darkness parted. Something slid across the stone floor toward the edge of the ash circle. It was David's coat. Then David's arm. Except the arm was gray, stretched twice its normal length, and ended in fingers that clicked together like dice. More parts followed, tumbling out of the void. A disjointed puzzle of a boy, reassembling itself piece by wet piece, just outside the protective ring of gray ash. The thing on the floor looked up. Its jaw hung unhinged, skin stretched impossibly tight over a skull that was far too wide. It grinned with too many teeth, and spoke in David's voice, high and thin and dripping with fluid. "I missed you down here, Julian. It's so cold without skin." Julian stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of the ash circle. A tiny breach opened in the gray dust. The moment the ash disturbed, the shadow didn't lunge, it simply was everywhere. The candle extinguished. Total velvet blackness swallowed the cellar, accompanied by the sound of wet footsteps rapidly circling the perimeter of the room, closing in from the dark. The darkness was not empty. It was thick, dense as black grease, pressing into Julian's eyes and nostrils until he felt he was drowning in cold ink. The wet footsteps didn't just circle, they accelerated, slapping against the damp stone with a wet, rhythmic cadence that blurred from left to right, spinning him in place. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of David's dislocated fingers tapping on the floor was right beside his left boot. Julian threw his hands out, his fingers brushing against rough, freezing mortar as he backed blindly into the corner of the cellar. His breath came in ragged, hyperventilating gasps, but the air he inhaled felt toxic, tasting of copper and rot. A sharp, searing pain shot up his right calf. He bit down on his lip to keep from screaming, tasting warm iron. Something cold and impossibly thin had wrapped around his ankle. Not a hand, but a band of freezing pressure like a tightened wire, sinking straight through his denim jeans. "Found you," whispered the voice, vibrating inside the marrow of his shin bone. Panic overrode terror. Julian lashed out with his left foot, kicking blindly into the void. His boot heel connected with something hard and unyielding, like striking a frozen oak trunk. A hollow, rattling shriek, like iron grates sliding over stone, ripped through the room, vibrating the fillings in his teeth. The grip on his ankle vanished instantly. Stumbling forward, Julian's hands hit the workbench against the back wall. His frantic fingers clawed across the splintered wood, searching blindly among rusted tools and glass jars, until they wrapped around the heavy plastic barrel of a high-lumens work flashlight. He slammed his thumb against the rubber switch once, twice. Click! A searing beam of white-hot light cut through the cellar, piercing the blackness. Julian swept the beam frantically across the floor. The reassembled thing was right in front of him, less than 3 feet away. It crouched on all fours like a spider, its limbs bent at impossible reverse angles. David's face, stretched and waxen, the eyes completely milky and vacant, stared directly into the flashlight beam. A thin stream of dark fluid leaked from the corner of its slack mouth. Behind it, towering against the rear wall, the massive, faceless silhouette reared up, its static-filled fissure gaping wide as it absorbed the light, drinking it in. The thing on the floor twitched, its neck snapping upward with a sickening pop, and it lunged forward, opening jaws lined with endless rows of needle-thin teeth. Julian threw himself to the left, just as the snapping jaws clamped shut on empty air, his shoulders slamming hard against the damp stone wall. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, but he kept his grip locked onto the flashlight, sweeping the blinding beam back toward the center of the room. The creature on the floor didn't fall. It twisted its torso a full 180 degrees in a fraction of a second, the joints in its spine grinding like crushed glass. David's face stretched into a hideous mockery of a smile, the skin tearing at the corners of the mouth as it hissed, a sound like pressurized steam escaping a valve. Behind it, the towering pillar of absolute shadow expanded, blotting out the stray rays of the flashlight until the beam looked like a frail, dying needle of white. The temperature in the cellar dropped past freezing in a single heartbeat. Frost exploded outward across the stone floor in jagged, geometric patterns, racing toward Julian's boots. "Look at what you made." The chorus of wet, choking gasps echoed inside his skull, rattling his brain against his temples. "Look at what you invited in." From the ceiling overhead, where the kitchen floorboards met the rotting joists, a thick, dark droplet fell. Then another. Julian looked up, squinting through the stinging cold. A heavy, viscous red liquid was beginning to seep through the seams of the old timber ceiling, dripping in a steady, rhythmic cadence. It pooled on the stone floor around him, but it didn't smell like rust or iron anymore. It smelled of ozone, scorched meat, and sweet, sickening decay. The reassembled horror began to crawl forward again, its long, gray fingers digging deep into the stone mortar, leaving smoking, gouged tracks behind it. Julian's back was flush against the corner. There was nowhere left to run. His fingers slid frantically over the body of the flashlight, searching for the strobe setting, his mind racing for anything, any scrap of the ritual journal, any forgotten rule, to stop what was coming out of the dark. The heavy plastic casing of the flashlight slipped in Julian's freezing, sweat-slicked palm. His thumb hammered blindly against the rubberized button, clicking it 3 times in rapid succession. Strobe. A blinding staccato pulse of raw white light erupted into the cramped cellar. The effect was instantaneous and violent. In the flashing strobes, the towering silhouette against the back wall didn't just cast a shadow. It fractured, splitting into 1,000 jagged shards of static that shrieked like tearing metal. The creature on the floor froze mid-bound. its unnatural limbs locking rigidly in place, as the intermittent light tore away its cohesion, exposing hollow, pulsing air where its organs should have been. Julian didn't hesitate. Pushing off the stone wall with every ounce of remaining strength, he lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight straight past the paralyzed horror and toward the cellar stairs. His shoulder clipped the wooden doorframe, spinning him hard, but his boots hit the first wooden riser. He scrambled upward, hands and feet clawing frantically at the splintered steps. Behind him, the darkness roared, a deafening, concussive wave of sound that blew the remaining cellar door off its hinges and slammed it upward with explosive force. A freezing hand of pure static grazed the heel of his boot, but the pulsing strobe light from the dropped flashlight, locked on the cellar floor below, kept the entity pinned in a dying flash of resistance. Julian burst through the threshold into the dark, empty kitchen, slamming the heavy cellar door shut behind him and throwing the rusted deadbolt home, just as something immense and heavy slammed against the other side, splintering the old wood from within. The deadbolt groaned, the heavy iron bolt sliding backward a quarter of an inch as the wood around the lockbox splintered into jagged splinters. A second, heavier impact hit the door, thud crack, and a gray, elongated hand punched entirely through the rotting pine panels just inches from Julian's face, its fingers snapping wildly like crab legs. Julian scrambled backward across the linoleum floor of the kitchen, his heels kicking up dust as he hit the base of the refrigerator. The hand inside the door writhed, the skin peeling back to reveal raw, blackened bone beneath, before it wrenched itself free with a wet tearing sound, leaving a jagged, ragged hole in the barrier. Through the gap, a single milky white eye stared out from the pitch-black void of the stairwell, fixated entirely on him. A voice, slipping between David's high, boyish pitch and the wet, choking chorus of 1,000 drowning souls, hissed from the fracture in the wood. "You can't lock a door from the wrong side, Julian. The house belongs to the foundation now." Before Julian could scramble to his feet, the floorboards beneath him gave a sickening, rubbery shudder. The linoleum cracked down the center, parting to reveal a wide seam of absolute darkness that mirrored the cellar below. From the fissure, thin, freezing tendrils of gray ash began to drift upward, curling around his ankles like grasping fingers, instantly numbing his skin to the bone. The freezing ash tightened around his ankles, binding him to the buckled linoleum, as the kitchen walls began to bow inward, groaning under the weight of the encroaching void. Julian stopped fighting. His breath came in shallow, rattling gasps, the fight completely drained from his limbs as the numbing cold crept up past his knees. Through the jagged hole in the splintered cellar door, the single milky white eye lingered, watching him with a terrifying, agonizing stillness. And then the voice changed. The chorus of choking gasps faded away, leaving only the clear, unblemished treble of his younger brother, sounding small and impossibly distant. "It hurts to stay, Julian," the voice whispered through the dark. "Let go." Tears finally broke free, cutting hot tracks down Julian's ice-rimed cheeks. He looked down at the dark, yawning fissure splitting the kitchen floor, not with terror anymore, but with a crushing, unbearable grief. He hadn't summoned a monster to bring David back. He had only opened a door wide enough to finally hear how far his brother had fallen, and how desperately alone he had been in the dark. Julian closed his eyes. He stopped pulling against the ash. He didn't fight, as the cold fingers wrapped around his waist, drawing him downward into the quiet, settling embrace of the earth. He let his mind drift past the terror, picturing the way David used to laugh in the summer sun before the house, the basement, and the silence took him. As the floorboards snapped shut above him like a closing casket, swallowing the last sliver of kitchen light, Julian reached out in the dark and finally took his brother's hand. It was freezing, and it had no skin, but it was waiting for him. And in the absolute silent black, They were together again.